So, starting off, where did you grow up, and what was the music scene like?
I grew up in South Berkeley in the 70s and was listening to KDIA radio, KDIA Lucky 13, and just sort of soaked up the local scene. My brother uh, went further and was a musician around the area, and most of them say they was into jazz fusion, and that's like the Herbie Hancock, the kind of funk with improvisation on it. But that was open to everything, to the African music, to the Latin music, you know, to the club, to the funk. I mean, all of it. And so I grew up around, you know, a wide open view of the music. But then I just gravitated to the hard black funk. It wasn't something that I, you know, mapped out. I could just feel it right away. And I mean, the early stuff like Funky Worm, Ohio Players, Jungle Boogie messed me up. Then Hollywood Swinging uh, made me realize Kool and the Gang was not a joke. They were serious about how serious they was going to do their funk. And so, in a way, I was a few years past the James Brown. Now, maybe if I was in the East Coast, you know, he would have been more prominent. But I sort of came up right on everyone that was sort of working with that formula.
Mhm.
Stevie Wonder, Superstition, the Ohio Players, Ozzy Brothers, bands like that. Um, and then a few years later, I started to understand Sly and the Family Stone, Earth, Wind and Fire, uh, and and then of course Parliament, which led me to find Funkadelic,
Mm.
and then it became Parliament Funk, and then it was P Funk, and you know, so I saw where the mountaintop was, and just decided, well, let me just, you know, what do you do with the mountain? Well, you make that your pursuit. So I started climbing that funk mountain, and I witnessed them land the mothership at the Oakland Coliseum Arena in 1977, and you know, at the time, you just in high school clowning, partying, having a good time. But even then, I realized, man, this black band got four guitarists that are killing it. But then they got four horn players that are killing it. And then they got five or six gospel sounding vocalists that are killing it. And it's like, they're just taking, and then the keyboardist, you know, Bernie Worrell had all the cosmic gothic sounds to him. And it was like all that European stuff, all the African stuff, all the soul, all the blues, all the jazz. We got all of it. All of it belongs to us. And by putting it on the one, you're just like boom, boom, boom. It soaks in.
Now that's a perfect
So
segue.
I
That's a perfect segue because I remember in class, talk about how you taught us about how James Brown basically changed music with the concept of the one. What is the one?
well see the one means a lot, especially if you are raised in Western music and you're taught to write songs that sort of go, you know, verse over here, chorus brings it back, verse over here, verse over there. So your songs always go one, two, three, four, do tell it some more, and you have a certain cadence for how you write songs that tell story, you know, and the thing is most of that's melody driven,
Mm.
and so you write songs in a certain way, and you always have the beat, but you know, songwriters, you know, Joan Baez, you know, there's still a beat that she, you know, keeps track of.
Mhm.
But when, you know, the African music, the R&B, the stuff, you know, the beat was more prominent. And for James to move the emphasis of the beat away from the two and four to the one, all of a sudden you're hitting where you're kind of used to a pause. You're used to a sort of a rhythm that's supposed to lay back, then come back, then lay back, then come back. And James is punching you on that downbeat. And all of a sudden, you're not expecting the chorus anymore. You're going and going and going and going.
Mm.
So when you put it on the one, you kind of do away with the way most Western songs, most Western people are trained to hear music.
Mm.
And so there's no more bridge, not in the old-fashioned way. It's wherever you want it to be. And some of these songs don't even have a bridge. They just keep pumping, pumping, pumping. And what that meant to the musicologists was James Brown was re-Africanizing the music,
Mm.
because it's putting a groove in there, and you don't have to kind of own or buy into these Western ways of writing songs. And when you and I look at music of the diaspora, music anywhere in the Black Atlantic, whether you're talking about reggae or salsa or the Brazilian samba, any of that stuff, it's all beat driven. Even
Mm.
a go-go, it's like you make a beat first, and even hip hop, you make a beat first, and then you put your song on it
Hmm.
once you get your beat, right? And James Brown kind of opened the door up for that. So it's like it's rhythm, it's beat, it's drum and bass that drives it first. So he moved the whole mentality of it away from the Western formula, and then he let you just drop down in it so you never get out of it. So in that way, he re-Africanized the music, and he re-Africanized us.
Right. Something else I'll never forget in reference to the Godfather. So, if you could explain sort of what was going on surrounding Say It Loud, about how that affected his career, what made that come about, and something I'll never forget that people don't believe me to this day is if you can verify for me that there were no black children singing the hook of that song.
That's what I was told. And I remember doing the research, looking for the playground where they went and got the kids.
Mm-hmm.
And all of this was in a neighborhood in Hollywood where
Mm-hmm.
the recording session was. And Mr. Brown just told some of his staff, go get me some kids. And, they weren't going to go 20 miles to South Central LA just to find, somebody. And kids, you get kids excited, they'll deliver the goods. So it was just some kids in the North Hollywood area,
Mm-hmm.
at a school. And that's as much as I've been able to unpack from that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the thing is, the vibe was so strong at that moment. It was very important for anybody, really, uh, to kind of reach for something. We talked about it a little bit in that class. 1968 was about one of the toughest years of the century for people, because we lost Martin Luther King. There was a Kennedy that was running for president, Robert Kennedy. There were these riots in the 1968 Democratic Convention, really police riot. The war had turned inside out, and the U.S. was getting its ass kicked in the Vietnam War.
Mm-hmm.
And then civil rights movement had sort of run its course. All the coalition building was kind of falling apart, and the only ones that had sort of clarity, if you want to, align with it, were the militants.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was black power all over the place. And that was different from the civil rights sort of activism, which was sort of in a place. You knew where it was, the beginning and the end of it, you knew where that was. And black power was just all over. And what do? You have chaos going on, and it was hard to find clarity. And so in the middle of that, in the middle of the terrors of the violence locally, domestically, the violence around the world, the protests, the government, James Brown just stands up and he was under pressure because his idea of patriotism was he wanted to show he was a big international star. So he took his band to play for the troops in Vietnam
Mm-hmm.
in June of 1968. And for him, that was like, that makes me as big as Dean Martin and Bob Hope, and I'm one of those people. But at the time, people had drawn the connection between any affiliation with uh, that war and U.S. imperialism, U.S. Global force by violence, global control by violence, and it just people were just dead set against it. So he came back to the USA kind of under pressure to kind of rebuild his reputation, if you will. And so he kind of felt that energy, that it was time to do something that sort of made clear what was the energy in the street and what does it mean? What could be done with it? So he came up with that song, Say It Loud, I'm black and I'm proud.
Mm.
And it was a very powerful thing because a lot of people will say I'm black, thank you, excuse me, I'm black. But no, he said no, he yelled it, he screamed.
Right.
And when I did some further work on it and work with the members of the Black Panthers band, I remember asking one of the players in the group, one of the musicians, I said, man, what did that song mean to you? He said, man, that meant everything. Let's say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud. He said, before that, it was I'm black and I'm ashamed.
Right.
And to flip it completely like that, that's heavy lifting.
Now, what was the flip side of that impact on his career, though? Because a lot of people don't know that didn't necessarily, he kind of went through a downturn after that for being that bold. Did mainstream radio pick up on that? I know we hear it at picnics, we hear it at at the soul festivals or whatever, but how did mainstream radio take on to that song?
Well, at first, it was just another one of those records from James Brown, who always got something different to say. And, if you study his music, there are a few songs that he builds on, but there's a lot of originality, hit after hit.
Mm-hmm.
Even with the same formula, the same band, he'll get them to do, or they will come up with different things and he'll put them in there. So people were just sort of at first taking it in. That was a pop song. It was number 10 pop music
Mm-hmm.
in the fall of 1968. But then the resonance of that, the fact that it was, played, it was the number one song when the Olympics were taking place in Mexico City when the brothers put the fists up, and that resonated because that broke all the rules. Those two brothers went through decades of just trials and tribulations because they stood black and proud with their fist up, right? And so you can say, well, they didn't do much. Well, they did because they broke the glass that was there. They broke the mold, and James Brown did a similar thing. And so there was a reaction in that James Brown's subsequent records just never broke through the pop charts again.
Mm-hmm.
James never slowed down. He kept on going, and so he was more beloved in the Black community. And his records from that point on for a good 10 years went straight to number one R&B, number one soul.
Mm-hmm.
But the rest of America really didn't hear much from James. The folks that just sort of sat around and watched American Bandstand and listened to pop radio, they didn't get exposed to him. But right after that, or right in the middle of that, is when James Brown was producing his music that was the strongest, hardest stuff that was the building blocks for the hip hop beats.
Absolutely. It's funny you bring that up because I always try to bring up a relic from the past. You might remember this. I actually still have my reader from 2011, African American Studies 159 of Black Popular Music and Culture from Bebop to Hip Hop, instructor Dr. Rickey Vincent. I still have my reader. I still use this to this day. I connect the music with my youth in terms of hip hop, how you showed us, the gospel hymns and the gospel music and the blues and how that eventually, evolved into what we call hip hop today.
Yeah. It's all connected. And the thing is, the young generation is just taught that, well, I just made this up, so I'm great. Give me all my, just see my auto tune. And I said, well, that auto tune is trying to do what the greats were doing.
Absolutely.
And so if you want to improve yourself, if you want to be constantly growing, you need to know, and you just need to know that you're a part of this river that's been flowing. And the young generation just thinks they're just a fish out of water and they're doing their own thing. And it's not that way. And you can be a free spirit and yet still be connected to these traditions, these approaches, these flows, if you will, because that connects you. That connects your spirit. Connects you. You understand your connection to the ancestors. You may, at first, you may not be, but then once you step back and see all the techniques you're using. Once you step back and see that, you know, you're just trying to entertain, even if you're just trying to entertain people, you're still connected. But the outside forces of capitalism commodifying our creativity, you know, that's some, you know, we've been fighting against that poison for about 150 years.
Yes, yes. So to give folks more context, I think this is a perfect segue. Tell us about your book, Funk, the music of the people and the rhythm of the one.
Okay. So, you know, in the 70s, that's what was happening at the time. In the early 70s, this music was raw and funky, and they didn't necessarily call it the funk, but you could collect the records and find it. And then George Clinton started to treat it like a religion almost. And so you're just like, man, I got to get some of that funk. You know, you got to have that funk. Um, and then you realize folks start to imitate it in different ways.
Mm.
Disco music becomes really popular. Okay, dance club music, what is now known as EDM, electronic dance music,
Mhm.
right? The industry recognizes that now. But what was happening was everybody in America, even people with no rhythm, wanted to be on Soul Train. Everyone wanted to do the, you know, the Soul Train dance, but they could, so they created their own sort of low calorie version of the Get Down. Okay, but the dance just became more and more and more popular as the 70s wore on. Everybody wanted that dance beat, boom, 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 boom. And I'm sitting there going, everybody wants this funk. They might want the lightweight version, but they still want it. It's like Bruno Mars, where he's funk, he's not funk. Well, people still want to feel good and dance and da 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 da. And so I started to, I dug in. I was not the only one. I was a music snob though, and I still remember being at the high school parties, going, "That song is derivative of these other guys that invented it, where everybody else is having a good time."
That's me with hip hop right now. I'm a hip hop snob.
Yeah, and I mean it's good, but you have to manage those standards and what you're gonna do with it.
Right.
If you're just gonna walk away from having a good time. So I tried to tell y'all, you know, if it feels good and you're having a good time, that's fine. You can step back and analyze the political economy of the music at another time and place.
Mhm.
When time there's a time and place to just have fun, no matter what the beat is. But but at the time I was realizing there's something important here. And then almost overnight, I graduated Berkeley High School in 1979. And by 1980, the sound started to turn a little bit more towards Prince, Rick James, and Michael Jackson. Okay.
Mm.
And it was still good music. And it really, to me, the issue wasn't that it it went a little, and the squeak got a little higher pitch, and Michael Jackson and Prince. That's okay. But what happened was the industry sort of custodians were telling every new artist, you want to hit, you better sound like Prince,
Mm.
Michael Jackson, or Rick James. And so the diversity of the sound really suffered. And so I noticed that. And then hip hop kind of blew up and kind of was a smack in the face of the industry who thought they were in control of it. And these kids had too much power, too much vibe, too much rhythm, and too much funk. They were bringing back the funk.
Yet another thing that I still say to this day that I'll never forget. You taught us how hip hop, if not the, is definitely one of the only genres created by young people.
Yeah.
There was no restraints on it because no one knew how to take it because it was created by young people. It wasn't like it was jazz that had these rules. Like kids created this music.
There were no elders
Mm.
in the creation of hip hop. Your elders was your auntie's record collection, your big brother's record collection. Those are your elders because that's what you learn from. You got those rhythms and beats and the attitudes from that, and then put and made it happen yourself. So you can look at it one way or the other. I made it happen myself, or you can say, well, you made it happen because you connected, you know, to that river, that flow, okay, in a different way. You didn't apprentice under somebody like a blues performer might.
Mhm.
So, but the connections were all there. And then when they brought the funk back, you know, it's like disco tried to make the funk go away, and the hip hop brought it right back. And so you can't make this fade. You can't fade this funk. And so that was a beautiful thing. And it opened these creative doors for people that were producers that knew how live music and hip hop production and rap and singing all work together.
Hmm.
And so the masters were, a lot of them were doing this stuff. Some of it was underground, but you could hear it in Dr. Dre's production. You could hear it in a lot of people that were putting singing and rapping together. And it doesn't have to be a lecture. It could just be a great tune that you feel, and then you feel what they say, and then the hook comes on, like when Arrested Development did People Every Day.
Hmm.
That song was great, even if it wasn't a remake of Sly and the Family Stone.
Right.
And you bring in I'm Everyday People. And so people knew what, a lot of artists knew what they were doing. And then outsiders would tell them, keep it simple. Don't give us any depth. Don't give us any history. Don't give us any stories about your grandmother. Don't give us any stories about your struggle. Just keep it, as simple as possible. And that's been the battle ever since.
Hmm.
Uh, for a lot of us, you can go back to your foundations to help you fight against that, to help you fight against being whitewashed. And you don't even know you're being whitewashed. You're just trying to hustle a gig with somebody, giving you a hassle.
Pulling out of my hip hop snob bag, tell the people who TACKHEAD is.
TACKHEAD, well, you can start, the best way to teach a younger person what that is to go back and listen to The Message by Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. And if you listen to the songs around that time, the, the Rapper's Delight and Curtis Blow, These Are the Breaks, and these other things, um, the message has a real kind of intense, metallic, industrial sound to it. But
Mhm.
it also has a bump because it got that Doug Wimbish, and but it sounds, it has the feel of a concrete jungle. Okay, and it's real futuristic, but it's right on time. It has, you can tell real musicians are doing it, but
Mhm.
it also makes you feel like it's concrete and metal in all directions. And if you're coming up in New York, that's your experience a lot. You walk up, come out the subway, and every direction you go, everything is paved, built up, and it's just, you're in this, immersed in this.
Mhm.
And a lot of us on the West Coast don't even understand that. We don't understand how impacted that is, but it's real. And so TACKHEAD was the band that could really reflect the industrial funk of the day. And that's these three brothers that made hardcore hip hop funk beats that people feel and remember, but don't even know it's them.
Mhm.
Okay, that's Doug Wimbish, Keith LeBlanc, and Skip McDonald, and they're on a lot of tracks. They're on James Brown's uh, duet with Africa Bambaataa, Peace, Liberty, Love,
Love,
and Having
have
Fun.
fun.
And even if that's not your favorite song, when you listen to it, you're like, whoa, that's where it's headed. That's where the big noise and the big sound is headed. And because our drama is bigger and bigger, and so they reflected that. So TACKHEAD is no joke. It's ironic that they are maybe the most important underground musical group of that era, and not enough people really know about them.
I try to highlight to my youngsters how much the musicianship, they think hip hop started with just drum machines and that everything was on the board. And I showed them Nucleus's jam on it. The brother has a guitar. There's a drummer in the group. Like it, the musicianship was there from the beginning. And that's what kind of now is just this in the box set thing. And it's not organic. That's just basically to me what happened. I try to keep from being the old head that's like, oh, I never tell them it's not hip hop. I never give them that line. I mean, it's hip hop. Hip hop really, you can't put it in a jar. But I just try to remind them, and they have to know who TACKHEAD is, and they have to know who these artists is, because, as you said, it's in this continuum that has been you. We're just a seed within a seed, basically. But you also, I wanted to mention, you host a show on KPFA, The History of the Funk. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, the history of funk grew out of being in college radio in the 1980s, and everybody else was into 1985, 86, Michael Jackson, Prince, boom, boom, boom. And I stuck to my Ohio Players and Parliament and Brick and Cameo and things like that. And then the samples started to really overtake the music. 86, 87. I Know You Got Soul. That was Eric B. and Rakim. Public Enemy started to do that. And then the Beastie Boys went nuts,
Mm.
sampling and looping everybody, right? And people started to come to me. I said, well, where did that one come from? Where did this one come from? There wasn't no YouTube, wasn't no Shazam, there wasn't a way to find out that stuff. And DJs, held the knowledge, held the secrets to
Mhm.
that. And so I started my show, I had a college radio show, and it started to be a real kind of source for that old school music.
Mhm.
And the old school music was being heard in the samples on commercial radio, on the pop hits. Everybody was doing it. East Coast, it was almost all a James Brown lick, maybe some Kool and the Gang, maybe a Schoolboy Crush, Average White Band, things like that. But then the music started to make its way to the West Coast, and it was that slap. It was all about Zap. It was all about Bootsy. It was all about, Big Parliament, Theme from the Black Hole. That's what we like out here.
Mhm.
Um, and people was asking me where'd that come from? How did you get that funk to happen? And so I realized that these a lot of the hip hop that was coming through was really a music lesson, a history lesson.
Mhm.
And I said, well, somebody got to spell it out. So, on the show, I was just laying out the history of this funk, how it happened. And then I started to realize this is bigger than that. I was taking a class at UC Berkeley on the history of African American music by this guy named Ollie Wilson, who's a legend at this point. He passed a couple years ago. And I started to see how all these pieces are connected. 2 semesters of intense lessons about Black music. The last day of this 2 semester class, Professor Ollie Wilson brings his scratchy 45s of James Brown. Okay, he plays the Papa's Got a Brand New Bag and plays Super Bad. And I'm looking at him and I'm like, okay, he's playing on the last day. When I teach my class, I'm gonna be playing those on the first day, and we'll be going from there. And so, it all started to fit as an idea that the history of a funk is its own story that needs to be told. And I was concerned that an outsider would come along and tell it in a whitewashed version.
Mhm.
And there are some outsiders that play a very important role, but I just kind of took one look and I said, well, I don't want to be upstaged by an imposter when the main line hasn't been spilled out there. And I was looking at Leroy Jones Blues People. That's something we had to read at first. And I said, I want to do something down there like that. It gets into what was the motivation of the Black people that made this music.
Mhm.
So I stayed there, and then it was, how do I capture the attitude? Because in my view, you couldn't explain funk unless you came with a funk attitude in your explanation. Otherwise, you're not describing it properly.
Right.
You have to have some bang, some splank, some super groovelistic liquid language up in it. So I just said, okay, let me listen to my P-Funk, listen to my Parliament Funkadelic. Let me read my album covers with Pedro Bell's artwork. Let me get into that. All right, now I can explain it properly. So in that sense, it was just something that needed to be a story that needed to be told about where the modern music was coming from. And I did that in the 90s, and then just hunted down uh, somebody that would publish it. But obviously, if you're looking for a publisher or something, if you did a serious work, that meant you looked up a lot of other people. So you just look at who published all those other people, and then you approach them. So it can be done if you're hungry to get something done. There are systematic ways to do it. So I finally got somebody to pick it up off the input box when it came into their offices, and boom, St. Martin's Press published that book on the funk in 1996.
Mhm.
And at that point, uh, people, I mean, there was a lot of, changes in music happening and a lot of people saying things. So not everybody understood that this type of thing would have some staying power.
Right.
But, not, there really hasn't been, any real gear shift in the music since then, since
Mm.
the funk era. There've been little permutations, reggaeton, there's been little, trap beats, there's been little things that have come around, but nothing really has had the impact that the funk has had.
Hmm.
So people keep coming back to it and they want to know more about the funk. How did we get here? How the funk did we get here? And then the other thing is, Black folks now are finally telling their own story.
Mm.
Okay? It's not diluted. It's not. Um, Thank you, white America. Will you approve of my narrative now? Nobody's asking for permission any longer. And once you get there, then you realize that these wild, crazy Black folks, Sun Ra, Jimi Hendrix, Miles Davis, these people were fully formed. And most of the drama they had was that people couldn't conceive, they couldn't understand how free these people were.
Mm.
And they were free in all their intellectual power, the spiritual power, the creative power. And it was all people could try to, outsiders could try to do is just put it in a box
Now
and say,
that's a perfect segue to this next person, Brother Rick James. Seems like they're rediscovering Brother Rick now. I know that there's a Tribeca Film Festival. There's a documentary. I think it airs in September on Showtime, and I saw the preview the other day. And ironically, they were interviewing Brother Bootsy Collins, and they were saying how Rick James was able to do something that other funk groups weren't able to do, which was meld with pop music and make funk pop. And how, although there wasn't a beef, Rick kind of touted that he sold more records than the other quote unquote funk groups. And Brother Bootsy Collins speaks on how, that kind of rubbed the godfather of it, Brother George Clinton, a certain kind of way. What's your take on, as you said this? I'm interested to see how do you retell a Rick James story, first of all? That's why I'm just kind of interested how they're going to package this.
see, that's the thing. You can't just uh, abstract it and sort of quantify Rick James. He's rock because he's a rebel, okay,
Mhm.
and he was punk funk, but he wasn't really trying to be in there. He's R&B. Everybody loves his R&B, but his albums always have some more than R&B in them and on them. And that's why so much of his R&B is so good, that he has these little hooks and little pockets and little pieces that we don't even know he's bringing all this musical mastery to the forefront. And yet he's ghetto fabulous, and people can't process all of that,
Right.
because you would want your jazz musician to play those chords in a way it goes dun, 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 and and then you want your street sound to be just raw and primitive. And Rick James connected all the dots. Now,
Mm-hmm.
Rick James, because he's gone through it, he was in a rock band called the Minor Birds in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
He was trying to be Neil Young. He was trying to, come up trying to think because there was a guy that played with Jimi Hendrix that was like his lead vocalist for a minute, Curtis Knight, sort
Mm-hmm.
of a black hippie type of thing. And Rick was trying all kinds of hustles in the 70s. And so he finally settled in on the club sound that he put together, and Motown finally kind of opened up to him in the later 70s. But he has so many other styles. If you ever saw a Rick James show, he'd play your hits, but in between those hits, there'd be a little kind of swing jazz, little breakdown in the middle, just to mess with you, just to let you know uh, he's been all around the world, and he's come to you with this funk that you like, but there's a whole lot more behind it. And I
Mm-hmm.
always loved that about him, because he was an unabashed, street character. He was the urban life. He was that street life. Was Tupac thug life? He was thug life, but he was a meticulous musician.
Mm-hmm.
But it was at a time where folks are trying to pull that apart. My era of the 70s, you could have these thugs making this music, and it was very meticulous. And at that time, people didn't try to unpack it all. They were just soaking it all in. They were soaking in how ghetto fabulous and how musically brilliant all this funk was. Rick James comes along and he does a very similar thing, but at the time, people felt like they had to put these niggas in a box.
Mhm.
They had to say, well, are you street? Well, if you're punk funk, yeah, but you black, you can't be punk. Oh, there's plenty of black punk rock. But it was just, he just said, the hell with all your bitches, I'm gonna do it this way. And so people don't recognize the musical mastery that he has, and they just want to take, the ghetto mastery that he has, or the rock rebel mastery that he has, or his, creative and personal ins and outs with Tina Marie that he
Mhm.
has. That in itself is legendary,
Mhm.
right? So it's too bad because a lot of even when I think of Rick James, sometimes I think of what club hit can I put in the mix before I slow down and say, well, wait a minute, he's got a whole lot of other dimensions to him, but we always think of him as Rick James, bitch, and
Yep.
that's it.
Exactly. And that's my worry with this documentary. I hope that at the end of the day, that's not what he's whittled down to. I mean, like you said, a music master. And is it true or false? He kind of kept Motown afloat for a minute with when Rick James records, he basically resurrected Motown, and I don't think he gets enough credit for that. Definitely during the 80s, early 80s.
In the 80s.
What else
And
was good for that?
I think Street Songs was the biggest seller that Motown ever had. When
Mm-hmm.
you go look at the top 10 albums of all time, maybe What's Going On is up there. Maybe some Stevie, but then Street Songs maybe in the top 5 with Thriller and just a few others, and some Al Green or something. But he doesn't get his credit because everybody just sort of slices a piece off of Rick, and that's unfortunate because he's not here to tell his story like that. I mean, he told his story. Have you seen his self-published book? That's a big old book with some wild tales in it.
Mm-hmm.
So he told his story. That was a while ago now, and my issue here in 2021 is that a lot of these folks that are legends, that even though they feel like they're current, they're 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. And the ones that are still living are deserving of lifetime recognition, lifetime achievement. And there's no institution, there's no Black institution that's capable of giving, Larry Blackman and the Bar-Kays lifetime achievement awards to reflect how much they've done. Not to mention Earth, Wind and Fire, P-Funk. I mean, nobody's really
Larry Graham.
in position. Larry Graham. I mean, nobody's in position to no institution is there. Now, there's a few brothers with money. Either they come from music industry or athletics. There is money for it, but the understanding of it is not really there. And that's a tough thing for me to watch because it's a slow process. People starting to figure this out. They've having the Jay-Z is like connected to the NFL. And so he managed to get what's the Puerto Rican lady and J Lo, Shakira to do the Super Bowl.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, oh, wait a minute, man. Have you ever seen Kool and the Gang do a halftime show? They smoke it, right? Morris Day and the Time do a Minneapolis set.
Mm-hmm.
Let P-Funk come on there and kill it for 15 minutes. And bring in a few rappers, and Kendrick and a few rappers in there. You can make all these pieces fit if you had that understanding. But when you come up without it, is that their fault or is it our fault as a people that we don't even tell our own history? We don't even say what is valuable to us and what is meaningful to us. And so that's a difficult thing. And it's kind of splintered down to a lot of that stuff is regional. There's all these history lessons in Beyonce videos because she does a lot of stuff in the Deep South,
Mm-hmm.
and you can see all the cultural references. But her parents were there when the funk was big. So when are you gonna tell those big stories? The other thing is that's heavy overhead to try to reconstruct what those folks were doing.
Mm-hmm.
And you can have a funny little spoof of it. Key and Peele make fun of the P Funk. You have other people having fun with it, But if you try to reconstruct the grandness of the Mothership Show or one of those Earth, Wind, and Fire concerts where they're floating in a pyramid that explodes and in the dust they kind of
Their concerts were actually magic shows. Like
magic shows.
there's some
Yeah.
old Earth, Wind, and Fire concerts. There was like magical elements to it, literally.
Yeah, illusion and yet these spiritual messages and all these things, and they weren't extreme. They were tied into what our music has always uh, anticipated and hoped to deliver to people if they could, and these people could and did, and then that story's not told.
Someone I also bring up is Blowfly. You mentioned Beyonce. Upgrade You samples Blowfly, and most people have no idea who he is and how many songs. I mean, I know he had literally dual identities in music. You know, he was writing all of these ballads and other songs, but the Blowfly character that he created, but that song Upgrade You, which is one of her biggest hits, samples Blowfly, yet no one knows who Blowfly is. And that to me is tragic in itself.
See, we don't know how to tell our own stories, okay? And we don't know how to recognize. So what you're telling me is some European person of African descent is liable to come over here and produce a film on the life and times of Clarence Reed, aka Blowfly, and it could be brilliantly done. And me personally, I love it when any person of African descent does something that contributes, but it will say a lot about what we don't know how to do very well. And that's like, we don't know how to tell our story. We don't even know how to tell our raw stories as well as our sophisticated stories. And we're kind of caught with outsiders commodifying that, whatever it's going to be. So people have to really kind of bear down, and then sometimes you have to attach yourself to something that's already been done, and then say, look, I'm responsible for reflecting that work, so get out of my way. I need to be able to do this. And so we'll see what happens. There's a lot of filmmakers out there, and sometimes I get discouraged with the hip hop, with the current music. I'm not going to say hip hop, with the current music, the way it's packaged. And I'm like, all these things are happening to Black people, and it doesn't come out in the current rotation of our music, of the pop music, or what's told to us as the Black music. And for the last few years, these Black made films have told these multi-layered tales of our lives. Okay, Black Panther, Blind Spotting, um, Sorry to Bother You. There's all these wild films that tell our story in the layers of life that we experience these. And like, our music should be doing that too. And then I look at how locked down the industry is, and it's tough to be that creative and tell that many layers of our story.
A crystallization of that is the fact that Drake just won a Billboard Artist of the Decade, and Drake has yet to ever take a social stance on anything, but he's the artist of the decade. That says it all.
See, and what can you do? Because there are other factors, and there are other people involved that are going to profit off of you no matter what. So it's tough, Even if you say, we have a holiday for our own, they'll commodify that. And here we are on Juneteenth Day, which now the government has started to commodify off of it and call it their own day. So it's tough. You just gotta stick your nose to the ground. And if you stay true it, if you get lost, you go back to what that beat is that keeps you going. That's the funk over here. And a lot of people are digging into something that's a variant of the funk. That's how I approach it, right? So if it's hip hop, it's cool. If it's reggae, is cool. All this is coming out of sort of the awakening that happened for just a couple of decades that has changed the way the music of the world is made.
And speaking of the beat and Bay Area and geography, I remember you mentioning something about the funkiest drummers coming from the Bay, funkiest white drummers coming from the Bay.
That's right.
You elaborate on that a little bit?
It's interesting because a lot of them have gotten together, and it was sort of a random thing. In the jazz fusion world, there's a bro by the name of Paul Jackson who plays bass, and he was there when Herbie Hancock did Chameleon, that boom, 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 boom. That original song is 15 minutes long. And some of that little bump is in there and some of it's not. And it's freeform funk, jazz funk. And he was Homeboy's partner with this drummer named Mike Clark. And they both came up in East Oakland together. They lived together and they lived across the parking lot from Everett and Jones Barbecue. And they were broke. And Everett and Jones Barbecue people said, you make us a commercial for KDIA radio and you can have free food. And so they made some food. I mean, it just embedded in the community what that vibe was. And Paul Jackson died earlier this year, and we had Mike Clark on, and he was talking about just the vibe of that time and that place. And I said, man, what was it like with the clubs in Oakland? And you come out of your club and down the street, there's somebody else hitting. It's like those beats that were being played. It was like war drums, and I was hearing what he was saying because that's early 70s, the Black Panthers, the Oakland Raiders, all these different you know pockets of energy, of black pockets, and you didn't matter what color you were, you could feel that. And so then you have some folks that just are tapped into their feel, right? A lot of drummers are tapped into their feel, their rhythm, and they were just so immersed in it. They were just like dipped in the chocolate there. And Greg Arico, the drummer from Sly and the Family Stone, just naturally had happy feet. That's what they call them, happy feet. Mike Clark, Dave Garibaldi on Tower Power doing squib cakes, these things. And there's a guy in the Santana band named Mike Shreve, a couple other cats. And he told me Tower Power just did a big 50th anniversary concert. And I interviewed Dave Garibaldi. He's like, we got together and we talked and, we all were friends. He said they got together back then and, talked shop. And they said, one thing we never did was we never copied each other. One thing that we do, we're playing rhythm, we're playing these funk bands, but they weren't gonna sound like each other. And if you step back and listen to the rhythms of these people, these are all original. And usually, Malcolm X explained, he said, white people can't innovate and they can imitate well if it's structured and written for them, but somehow out here in the Bay, there's such a free spirit. There's a place where people can be not limited by boundaries of race and culture. They can just hit that vibe. It's happened here, and it's almost like nobody notices because, yes, Sly and the Family Stone was a multiracial band, but we knew it was black, but it had these white players in it. So it's an interesting irony. The only problem is it doesn't translate well to somebody on the East Coast that's trying to think of this music in binary word, in a binary formula, but there's a vibe out here that anybody can tap into, and we've seen it. We see it in all the different types of folks and grooves that are in the music scene that we're a part of. So it's funny to me, but it shows something bigger. There's something bigger out here. There's this aura, this entity, this attitude that we have, that we're not trying to copy anybody. We're not trying to imitate anybody. We'll build on anybody's stuff and make it this East Bay funk. And that's what we have.
So on that note, in closing, why is it important to keep the funk alive?
Well, early on when I was checking out the hip hop, and it was tough because there were people. I was watching Soul Train the day that Don Cornelius told Curtis Blow, I never really liked your music.
Yes.
I was like, who, Don, why you got to say that? You might think that, but why was your resentment so deep that you couldn't at least cool it out till you're off the air and say that? So there was a big divide generationally, right? And we've talked about it, how the youngsters picked up on the vibe and the music, and often they did it with their aunt and uncle's record collection as opposed to somebody showing them technically. And so there's a distinction between what some people call real music and some people call rap. They're not even thinking of it as hip hop. They're not even thinking of it as something part of the tradition. They just think of it as not music. And so all those things are real detrimental to us understanding who we are and our power that exists in the moment and is fueled by our past. And so all these things are connected. And so I really struggle with the way the disconnect constantly is imposed on us. So it's very important to connect all our roots of our music. And it's in the book. If you study if you get to the roots of hip hop, you find yourself at the foot of the funk right there. James Brown, all the P-Funk, you find yourself, Sly Stone, you find yourself there. And if you go further back than that, then you're into all the other traditions, the jazz, the funk. And if you're serious about it, every artist in a current form of music is studying something behind it, okay? Something bigger than that. And so even when I was into the funk, most of the funk musicians I was into, they were studying jazz, okay? And then when you look at the jazz people, the John Coltrane and the Charlie Parker, those guys were studying classical music because they wanted to get all the melodies they could so they can toy with them and improvise over them.
Isn't that a line in Funk Getting Ready to Roll? When he says that, I dug jazz.
I dug jazz. I dug everything that could
That's my thing. I dug jazz. I dug rock. Everything with a swing. Yep.
And so they was into it. So it's just important that we know that, but we have to know that there are forces determined to disconnect us from our lineage and our traditions. And the thing is, hip hop is heading around it's around the world. I do a class now called Globalization in Hip Hop. And the last day we watched a movie called Mongolian Bling, where they got a hip hop scene in Mongolia.
Wow.
And they got conscious hip hop, commercial hip hop, female hip hop. I'm like, wait a minute, rewind. And they have the same issues that everybody else has, and that is, are you authentic to your culture or are you imitating outsiders? Okay, and that's everywhere around. But the way people want to get their voice out, the way people try to, make noise, they use current beats, they use modern beats, and they're using Black American beats. And that's just how it is. So on one level, you got politics around the world, but on one level, hip hop is taking over the world. And it'd be nice if you could just sort of trigger that and see what that could create in terms of a global consciousness that could really change things. But that's maybe that's pie in the sky. But if you understand the power of Black music, then it all makes sense.
Yes, yes. Well, Professor Vincent, I thank you so much for being on the Pachyderm podcast today. This is, as you continue to serve as a wealth of knowledge, when can we listen to and tune in to the History of Funk show on KPFA?
History of Funk show. And Brother D, I want to thank you for doing this now and putting this word back out. I'm on the radio Friday nights at 10 p.m. It's KPFA radio, like P-Funk, KPFA, KPFA radio, .org. It's on, there's a page on the KPFA website. It comes on Fridays at 10. I'm on Facebook. I'm easy to find that way. RickeyVincent.com, one word. I got my CD, my music CD is still making a racket, and I'm working on the second one now. So,
and you can also be seen in the TV1 Unsung series as well. You've been on quite a few of those.
I did one with P. Frank Williams, got me in the last one he did on Music and the Movement.
I plan on having that brother on here as well, another Oakland product.
Yeah, that's right. And so, we're just kind of doing what we do. And it's crazy. Even if we only known in Northern California, the world needs to know, but at least we're doing what we do.